We're gathered here today to do an oral history on the founding years of VLSI Technology, which was founded in 1980.
79.
79? Okay, wrong company.
First interruption.
That was my next company. It was founded in 1979, and we have the founders here and two of the earliest key employees, executive employees. And we're going to be discussing the founding years, the VC challenges, and early sales and businesses, and setting up our fabs. And we have quite a few things to cover. And let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Geri Hadley. I was employee number 28 and ran marketing and corporate communications for the first 5.5 years. And sitting with me is Paula Jones, who's also going to be one of the co-interviewers. And Paula.
Hello. I took over Geri's job when she left for the next 4 years.
And we'd like to get started and have each of the founders, actually let me say one more thing. VLSI was one of two startups in that period of time, LSI Logic and VLSI, and they both were in a new area which ultimately became known as ASIC, Application-Specific Integrated Circuits, or semi-custom. And they had different approaches to solving this, but both came out of the gate doing pretty well. And we at VLSI we really did a lot of the things that set the stage for how integrated circuits are designed today. So it's an important interview and important history to be captured. And to better understand the semiconductor industry and systems and how they all came together. At this point, we would like to start with the introductions of the founders, and we'll start with Gunnar Wetleson on the far right.
Oh, I thought I'd be last. My background in the semiconductors began with American Microsystems, and I was there for approximately 6 years. And that was when I got to know my colleague Dan Floyd, and we became part of the founding team of a company called Synertech, and that's where we got to know Jack Boletto. So there's the connection that VLSI was the third semiconductor company that I was involved with, and my role was always in technology, with a lot of that focused on the things related to memory development, because that was so central to pushing our technology ahead in all those companies. And since VLSI, well, I've been an underachiever, so I'll pass the mic.
I'm Dan Floyd. Gunnar set the history back to AWI, or AMI, not AWI. AWI was something else. But the three of us, Gunnar, myself, and Jack, were together at Synertech, along with Ron. And we grew that company very successfully and ended up selling it to Honeywell in 1978. And I left Synertech right after that, and Jack and Gunnar stayed for, another 3 months or so?
That's about a year.
About a year. And one day I got a phone call, said they were interested in starting another company, so we all got together again to start VLSI. And we started to work on that in 1979, I believe, early 79. And that was a challenging time, because there was no money available, and every venture capitalist said that they were never going to ever fund another semiconductor company because they weren't needed. And so we were the ice-breaking company for new funding of semiconductor companies. And right after we got funded, there must have been 10 within a couple of years. So we just opened the floodgates. So VLSI, I had the memory products group, and which were the ROMs and other types of products like that. And after we went public at VLSI in 1983, I ended up leaving there. 2 startups in a row were a little bit too much. So, and after that, I got involved in just some minor little products, some turnarounds on other companies that were in trouble, and a whole series of bed and breakfast inns along the coast of California, which which is a little bit different. It's like going, you know, at VLSI, we had all these highly skilled technical people, you know, PhDs in software development and everything else, and I got on the bed and breakfast business, and it was minimum wage people.
Well, you had the surf shop. Remember that? Santa Cruz.
I forgot the surf shop.
Better let Doug have a turn.
Anyway, I did a lot of miscellaneous things, and after we sold the inns, I moved to Montana, so I'm living up there now.
Okay, I'm Doug Fairbairn. I was not part of the first part of the group that came together. I joined them in the mid-fundraising activity. My background was at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where I was doing mainly systems engineering initially, and I got involved with Carver Mead and Lynn Conway in the development of the Mead-Conway IC or VLSI design methodology. And based on my background in that and systems, I decided it was time to start a magazine, so I got Xerox to help start a magazine called Lambda. In the process of doing the first issue, I interviewed these 3 guys, Jack, Gunnar, and Dan, who were starting a new company that was dealing with the custom IC issues that we wanted the magazine to focus on. And so I did that in November of '79 and ended up joining them a couple of months later in January. So I then subsequently took on responsibilities for design automation tools, eventually all the ASIC design and the ASIC business. I stayed at VLSI for almost 11 years, left in 1990 to start another company, Redwood Design Automation, which is purely focused on software, and which was then bought by Cadence in 1994. So Jack, you're next.
Yeah. I often wonder what happened at Fairchild if we had had Dan and Gunnar, because one luxury we had at Synertech and Greg Spadilla at both Synertech and VLSI was a top-notch wafer fab. And it's the first time after being in the industry for a long time, 10 years before we had a fab area that I could trust. And so at VLSI, we always had the lead. We're like the lead dog in one of those Alaskan sleds. We were always equal to or ahead of Intel, as a matter of fact, which makes it a lot easier on all the design people and so on. So we did Synertech, and before that, Fairchild, as Dan said, sold Synertech to Honeywell. By then, Ron was over in London for Synertech, so I can't wait to hear some of those stories about Acorn and ARM, because they used some of the Synertech products and they used some of the VLSI products. So 2 companies in a row kind of helped launch a couple of things there. After Honeywell bought the company, I stayed about a year. I went back to Minnesota with Bob Schreiner, the CEO, for the first budgeting meeting. Because at Synertech, all the memories, all the circuits have been designed with timeshare and Rubylith. And years before, people like Fairchild had 360 computers and automatic this and this and that. So we were finally going to get enough money to get our design guys at Synertech a mini computer. So they said, well, no, you really can't buy that one because they're a Honeywell spin-out, and you have to buy one we have, or will have in about a year. So in the taxi on the way to the airport, Schreiner's going like, well, I think it's probably time to start another one, huh? This is like death to us. And I'd already been talking to Dan and Gunnar, so I'm looking straight ahead at the airport like, oh, I don't know, Bob, it's pretty expensive. So anyway, that's what did it for me. Got back, got with the guys, wrote up the plan, a lot of which was just what we were doing at Synertech, customer-owned tooling is what we call it at Synertech, which is basically a foundry. How do you deal with other people's mass sets? So, embellished that, went out looking for money. 6 months into it, it was obvious that unless we could show them how to design chips, we were going to get nowhere with this foundry idea, and that's made it pretty easy to. And we've been talking to Carver Mead along the way, and he singled out Doug as the best cream of the crop out of Park to come join us as a founder. Then not too far into after the funding, we had Ron come over early to try to learn what Doug was talking about because I couldn't follow it.
I'm Ron Kasper, and I was Vice President of Sales at VLSI. But previous to that, I'll give you a little background. I actually moved from Southern California to Northern California for TI, the systems group, to open up their first sales office in Northern California. That wasn't the semiconductor group, that was the systems group. And then I went to work for electronic memories and magnetics. That was my first experience with memories. They even had some solid state semiconductors plus rotating memories. And then I got married, and we did about a year's sabbatical, traveled. And then I ran into this character next to me, Jack, who recruited me into Synertech. And when I went to work for Synertech, the next thing I knew, I was calling on Atari and two guys that you now know as Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. And we did the first design work for Apple, gave them their first line of credit, sold them the first read-only memories, designed in the 6500. Yeah. And we did the same thing with Atari, and I said, hey, this is not bad. At Atari on Friday afternoons, they had a cold keg that everybody was invited to come over. And it was an interesting experience. The first time we brought Apple in to see Bob Schreiner at Synertech, Wozniak and Jobs especially showed up in sandals, and Schreiner looked at them and go, we're going to give these guys credit?
Don't think so.
Little did we know. And according to Jack and everything else, did such a great job at those accounts that they had a guy that they had recruited to go to Europe to start European operations for Synertech. I think at the last minute he backed out. And so they said, would you like to go? And I went, why not? So we went to Europe and lived in Europe for 3 years. Started with virtually no sales and grew it to quite a nice piece of business, with the design center starting to do custom design for Synertech. That was Honeywell. We were doing thermostats for them. We were doing a lot of business with Olivetti, which Jack and I became very familiar with the Olivetti people, which really then influenced how Olivetti came in and helped finance VLSI. And in among all of that, I was doing business with a company called Acorn. And Acorn was buying 6500s from Synertech. And when we started VLSI, they became part of the group that started the ARM group. Mm-hmm. And we were part of the ARM group at VLSI along with Apple. Yeah.
There are now 2 ARMs shipped in every smartphone that goes around the planet.
Right.
If Intel's lucky, they get one, probably a half.
So when Jack started VLSI, I was still in Europe with Synertech, and he convinced me to come back. I kept asking him, but Jack, what is there? Why do you need a sales guy? What is there to sell? What is there to sell?
Smoke.
And it was like smoke and mirrors, yes. He said, come back, and I met this group, and I really liked them, but I said, Jack, there's nothing to sell. I don't know what I'm going to do here. And lo and behold, we started selling the thin man, the stick man that was doing circuit design, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And promoting this design technology. And I kept telling Jack, we need something else to really sell. And lo and behold, that's how the ROMs became part of this. But I'll stop there and let somebody else go on with the story. Good times, though.
It seemed like this was a perfect storm at that time because technology and the market changes were all coming together. The computers were coming together, being developed that would help enable designing chips, and the technology, the wafer technology, and the design technology. It was all merging finally at that time. And that was one of the reasons why, from my perspective, why the company came together and could take off like it did. And could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think you're right in the money. The need for a semiconductor company to be more responsive to its customers was becoming more and more critical. We had a situation with Hewlett-Packard, with HP, who was fighting it out with TI in the scientific calculator world. They were taking turns being number one, big stakes. And they'd contracted with AMI to design the next generation. AMI designed them, then they couldn't build them. So the HP is losing ground like crazy. They come to Synertech. We know you guys used to work at AMI. Maybe you can figure this out. Again, Dan, Gunnar, Greg, turn their factory upside down, figure out how to make this mass set work, which put HP back in the race against TI. Now, TI had their own chip capability, so not having a full integrated was pretty obvious. There's more to that story, too.
Yeah, there is.
The next contract to come out of HP, who do they give it to? AMI. Again.
But we got it back.
We got it back. Then Atari, same thing. Atari had contracted the design of the Pong chip with a consultant, shall we say, from the mountains. And lucky for us, he wasn't a very good designer because a lot of people tried to make yield with that mass set, including Intel and so on, and it came out junk. So again, our guys, last thing you want to do is mess around with your process, but when you got a hot, we concluded this is going to be a real big market. So they did it again, and we were the only ones who could make the Pong chip for 2 years. So we had a free run with those guys, with Atari, and then they used our micro, as Ron said. So the need was always there. The missing link, as we started talking to all these customers about, hey, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna have a spectacular way, manufacturing capability. All you gotta do is learn how to design chips, and they're all going, where do I go? And at that time, as I recall, there was a little place in Arizona called Integrated Circuit Engineering, which is real basic. You wouldn't, you maybe could do a watch or something like that. It was real basic.
If they were lucky.
So we were not going to get funded unless we could have figured out the part 2 to the puzzle.
Right.
And so nobody doubted we could and did create and perfect the foundry industry, starting way back at Synertech for that matter. And then when Doug and Carver and the Xerox part and the Caltech gang came in, that really was the other piece that we needed to get funded.
That's what opened the doors for you.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, side note on the HP thing, the first circuit they brought to us was for a heart monitor. And the heart monitor used to flatline, it would overheat. And every time one would flatline, the hospital would go crazy because they thought the patient was dead or dying. And Gunnar and his team had a technology figured out to make it run real cool, part run cool. So when this team came up with that and we integrated with their mass set, we fixed their chip problem, and all of a sudden it didn't look like anybody was dying anymore. So
Yeah. Cost them a lot of money.
it
Keeping
cost
those
them-
people alive like that.
they had
So-
to repair each one of those.
So getting back to the, trying to put together a team that would justify the financing. Carver Mead had said you ought to go talk to these guys. They were down in Los Gatos, and Dan, Gunnar, and Jack, and make a good story for the magazine. And I think he was actually just sort of setting me up to get introduced to them as a potential employee. And so what I was doing at Xerox PARC, fed exactly into the need that they had in terms of being able to generate an army of designers out there. It would prove to take a little while to do that, but in the end, we were very successful. But I think there's some interesting dynamics there in terms of just that whole startup period. It took 15 months from when you wrote the business plan to.
Oh, yeah.
So I think maybe talking a little bit about that would be.
And how long before you joined?
Well, they wrote the first business plan I saw. The date was September '79. I don't know if you
Yeah.
had something before that. I joined basically 4 months later in January of 1980, and we raised the money a year later, December of
Yeah.
1980. So it still took a year to do it.
Right.
But Jack, why don't you talk about sort of the
Well,
initial strategy in terms of going after OEMs and that kind of thing?
A month into it, we thought it was all funded. We had a letter of intent with Olivetti, the same Olivetti that we got to know so well at Synertech. And El Sereno Piol, the number 2 man, came over. So we had he smoked those big Italian cigars that would put you in the hospital if you sat next to him. So he wrote out a letter of intent. Jack, we're going to do the whole thing. And goes back to Olivetti. We've only been, this thing is the types, the ink's barely dry in the business plan. We were all set. Sends back probably a fax, I guess, in those days, that says everything's off. French company had bought 25% of Olivetti while he was gone. Saint-Gobain, I think it was called. Everything went on hold. Everything goes on hold. So he just bowed out, and then it took us another year and a half to get the funding. We've been turned down twice by Hambrecht and Quist. Pretty much everybody.
Oh, and Sequoia and
Yeah, Sequoia, all the guys. You know,
Kleiner.
Jerry Sanders had that thing like real men have fabs. You know, that was starting to become popular.
Yeah.
Or the foundries will never make any sense. So we were, until Carver, I had met Carver actually at Synertech. And part of the reason when I had that, we had the the bad meeting with Honeywell on the budget. I was still at Synertech. I've been meeting with Carver up at Rosati's and chit-chatting about just how big do you think this foundry, how many systems engineers can we really convert? And of course, knowing Carver was hundreds of thousands immediately. So I was sold on that. But we didn't get funded until there came a time when Carver, who was, I think, the first computer science student at Caltech, working for Ivan Sutherland, who started the computer science department at Caltech. So Ivan convinced Dave Evans, his old co-founder of Evans and Sutherland Computer Corp, at one of the board meetings that Dave Evans should look at what we were talking about to cut the cost of his simulation computers up, aircraft simulators pretty much. And Hambrecht's on the board. And Hambrecht, what are you guys talking about? So he didn't even know that his troops at H&Q had turned us down twice. Mm-hmm. But then so they convinced Bill, then Bill got a hold of us, and he convinced Kleiner Perkins. So we ended up with Kleiner Perkins, Venrock, H&Q, Advanced Technology Ventures, where Ivan Sutherland was a partner, and another one I can't remember. But it took that circuitous route because when we told the story, everybody's like cross-eyed. You know, what are you talking about? The industry has to be totally vertically integrated. You can't separate design and fab. They have to be in the same cubicle, and which was in the early days, 60s and 70s, or early 70s. That was true. Oh yeah, it was really needed because you were adjusting things on the fly.
And it was a new concept at the time too.
Yeah, I think that this the funding of VLSI convinced me that the stories about venture capitalists being lemmings was really a true story, because it really happened as Jack said. All the VCs had turned us down, and then Dave Evans says, "Okay, I'm ready to go." If Dave says it's okay, then Bill Hambrecht says it's okay. If Bill Hambrecht says it's okay, then every VC in the world wanted to be part of the deal. And,
well, then everybody in the queue, like LSI, they were a month behind us, so we got funded, so they got funded, so the ED Daisy got funded, and everybody that was necessary to make this whole disintermediation possible got funded.
The VCs started understanding the scope of what was happening.
Yeah, once they bought into it, they said, well, so we better fund everybody, because
Yeah.
it's hard to tell who the winner's going to be in this new sector, which I think now is probably half the market is probably traceable to foundry and EDA if you add up all the money.
Right.
But there were some important things that happened even before the funding. I mean, there was a year after I joined before the money came in. And so the question is, other than going and talking to potential vendors or potential financiers, what are we all doing? And so one of the things that I did was I was continuing to work on this magazine, which I had started at Xerox. And I was also started teaching a course in VLSI design at Hewlett-Packard, created a set of videotapes on IC design, which we subsequently used at VLSI. And I guess Dan and Gunnar were off doing other things at the time.
We had a technology consulting agreement with GE to help them with their new fab that they were building, and that helped keep the lights on, so to speak, because during that period from '79 till '81, obviously nobody was drawing a salary, but we also had all the expenses of running a startup operation, in the sense of trying to do fundraising and flying all over the country. You didn't mention Art Rock amongst the guys that we also pitched, and there were...
The one that really paid off was the fab contract with Ricoh to help bring up their foundry in Osaka. Earlier, back at Synertech, they were getting stiffed by AMI. Nobody would pay attention to Ricoh, so they couldn't get on the priority list to get delivery of anything. So they concluded pretty quick they had to do their own. That's why they almost bankrolled Synertech. then when they read that we were doing VLSI, they got a hold of me, and we contracted with them, and ended up just helping them design that fab area in Osaka, which proved out to be
And their first customer.
and their first. Yeah, we'll get into that later, but thank God we did that fab area, because otherwise the order Rom got, which we'll talk about later, I don't know where we would have built it.
Right.
In addition to the traditional VCs, there was also, VLSI took some very interesting approaches to financing, and there was Bendix, and that happened, I believe, in '82, as I recall, and then Olivetti came back in the fold, and then GE came to us, but that's another
That
story.
was GE Capital.
GE Capital.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, Bendix is one of those companies. They were really small. Yeah, they really couldn't get. Nobody would talk to Bendix. Most of their applications were military. It'd be like 1,000 pieces, you know. But I mean, it'd be like $1 million a piece. But no, still nobody wanted to. So we were talking to them, and they eventually, basically, co-signed a loan for us to buy the fab equipment, 20 million, 20 or 25 million, something like that. And QT Wiles was the chairman at that time. He taught me a trick I'd never heard of. So Bendix didn't, we wanted $3 million besides. They said, well, we don't want to invest in a small company because small companies sue us. So we got to figure out some other way to do it. So QT came up with this trick where they buy a CMOS process from us for $3 million. It's the book. And then they still co-signed the loan, which is all we really wanted. We wanted that plus $3 million. But we gave them warrants. So warrants, they don't have any liability as long as it's warrants. So Gunnar had to sit with somebody and for about a week type up this big thick CMOS,
The CMOS process.
latest greatest CMOS process book. So they gave us $3 million. I never thought of it, but that's one of the old QT had a few tricks up his sleeve.
They also helped support some of Doug's efforts too, didn't they? Didn't we have a development contract with them?
With Bendix? I don't know.
I remember something, but I don't remember making
did with
any visits
Olivetti.
to them. Olivetti and
Yeah.
Evans and Sutherland, who had put in $3 million of the initial $10 million, wanted to get all of their design engineers trained in VLSI design. So for the first several months when VLSI was just getting started after the funding, I commuted to Salt Lake City and taught a series of courses there to get their designers up to speed on how to use the technology in this new foundry that was being built at VLSI.
so at VLSI, you were having to be very creative and clever in your business arrangements, and it wasn't like a traditional semiconductor company that designed standard products, and sometimes they worked closely with customers on them, but sometimes they didn't. I mean, you were had a much closer relationship, and often the relationships were quite different with your customers. Some were like partners, some were like customers, some were investor customers. It was a new business model almost at that time. Is that a correct assessment?
I guess it was a lot like the regular. There was a lot of custom business went on back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, Intel's micros are mostly derived from custom contracts they had with Data Point and Visicom. So there was a lot. There was a lot of that.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the early days where we insisted Bendix, also give us $3 million in cash, and all we ever guaranteed them was they could get 10% of our fab capacity if they gave us 6 months notice. So that's like not giving away too much, because 6 months notice, you can ramp up 10% a piece of, anytime.
There was some interesting relationships along the way, though, because I'm going to jump ahead to the RICO scenario that we went through that one time.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
We decided when we got our ROMs designed, we needed to get a foundry to build them for us because we didn't have a wafer fab area. And Jack happened to have worked for the president of RICO? Or,
Yeah.
And so we knew they had the fab area, and we'd worked with them before. So we had a meeting with RICO. Jack and I went over to Osaka. Was it Osaka or?
Yeah.
Yeah. And had this meeting with their technology people and the president of RICO, trying to hammer out a deal. And we ended up with a technology agreement where they would build wafers for us and certain prices, that kind of thing, and capacity. And we were sitting in an amphitheater. There was a table like this, and there was this huge amphitheater just filled with people. There must have been 100 people in this room. There were quality people and engineers and just general observers.
Well,
I
Rico's
guess.
like the Xerox of Japan. And so what are they doing messing with this little stinky startup? And
So anyway, we go through this whole agreement, we work it out, and
In front of 100 people.
in front of 100
yeah.
people, come
Why
up
were
with
there
this
100?
more like
agreement.
a food fight than they're working it out. They're
Well-
yelling at each other and
Well, the end of it, though, is the finance guy gets up and asks Jack, how are you going to pay for this? And Jack said, what 90-day terms, because we don't have any money. You can see everybody's jaw just drop.
a lot of hissing.
And anyway, we argued back and forth for a few minutes, and I don't remember what we ended up saying we would do, but we got our 90-day terms.
Yeah.
And what happened is, right at the end of it, everybody turned around, and the president of Rico is sitting way up at the top there, and you could hear the eyeballs click as they all turned around and looked at him. He looked at him and did this.
Yeah.
It was yes, and he approved the deal.
It was like one of those movies, one of those Japanese movies.
Well, it was
thought
amazing because I'm sitting there, I
Kurosawa
couldn't
said.
believe what happened.
You see
And-
those samurai movies?
Yeah.
But the follow-on to that was even more intriguing. About, 3 months later, the Rico guy from San Francisco came into your office, and this guy brought a contract, I swear to God, was 2 inches thick. And he brings it in and wants Jack to sign this contract. And Jack takes a look at it, throws it in the wastebasket, and said, we have a deal. We don't need a contract. And this guy about fell through the floor, too. It was so funny to watch him react.
I have a question, and that is, what made you decide to do ROMs in the first place?
We needed business.
It was a fast
The thin man wasn't getting fat enough, quick enough, and so not enough revenue was coming in. And
No,
we-
Ron's are always in their first plan.
And we needed something to tweak the process.
Oh, yeah,
and
drive
all
the
that,
process.
Drive the process.
Yeah.
So that's how the
Yeah, I
whole
think we
concept
can
came
speak
about.
to that a little bit, that if you look at the family tree, if you will, of technologies and how, in the beginning, even if you go back far enough, even DRAMs were made with a process that could accommodate logic chips. As time went on, there was divergence, and so DRAMs went down a technology path, static RAMs went down a technology path, and eventually ROMs, became EPROMs and other things, a different technology path. But the mass-programmed ROMs that we were very good at, because when you're small, you're agile. One of our things built into the plan too was quick turnaround, right?
Absolutely.
As a kind of an ethic, if you will, part of the company culture, and a deliberate way in which to build the manufacturing facility with capacity that would allow that kind of quick turnaround. The mass program ROMs turned out to be a very, very close match to the requirements for the kind of advanced logic chips that could be developed using the suite of design tools, which Doug and his merry men there who worked at night into the wee hours to develop those tools, that technology base was fundamental. And Greg and Min Woo, I'm talking about Greg Spadilla, who headed up our process development technology effort. They built a set of scalable rules so that there could be almost a factor of 10 reduction in the dimensions, all within a common set of design elements. So once the standard cells were developed and modeled, and that would be part of the turnkey solution for using the advanced design tools, that set of cells, would go through generations of future products. And Greg had a wonderful background in CMOS, which was essential to that.
Yeah, just to reiterate, when I joined the company, ROMs were clearly a part of the product line and part of the strategy of the company to do those two things: generate early sales and to provide a technology base on which we could build the logic products. And there was no doubt that the work that I was responsible for in terms of developing design tools and educating people in design was a long lead time kind of business. We were developing tools that hadn't been developed before. We were educating people that didn't have any idea about IC design and so forth. And then you have the whole process of actually doing the design itself. So there was clearly, it was an exciting, tantalizing aspect of the company in terms of what it could eventually be and what could carry it in the long term. But it was clear to everybody from the very beginning that we needed a technology driver and a revenue driver to provide a sort of base level capability. And I think that switching to the story of the ROMs and where that early business came from is one of the more interesting parts of the whole thing.
And so, when did Phil Su played a very big role in his design team in the ROMs also? And when did he join the company? And where did he come from?
Well, they're all ex-Cinertech, aren't they?
Oh yeah, the whole ROM gang
And we
was
did ROMs.
ex-Cinertech.
Yeah, we all did ROMs at Cinertech. So
We
this is
brought
all
them in pretty
ex-Cinertech.
early.
Yeah.
Okay. I
Yeah.
think they were there by the time I arrived, as I
yeah.
recall,
Oh,
in
yeah, I don't know what's
late
Phil's
81.
badge number.
Well, that's a story about Phil at Thanksgiving Day of '81. So we all took the day off. We were in the Granger building at the time, subleasing. So we're at home carving the turkey and get a call from the Santa Clara PD. They've arrested a bunch of Chinese guys that have broken into the Granger building and are claiming they're working. So I had to go down. There they were. They're just these our Chinese engineers anyway. Probably all of our engineers. These guys just worked. I mean, they were just. I can't count the number of hours per day that these guys put in, and as a matter of fact, they still do. It's just incredible. But that getting all that done on time certainly saved the day, because later when we kept Ron caged up like a tiger at the zoo. He said, "No meat yet, no meat, no meat yet." Okay, now we got it wrong. Once we cut them loose.
So the first ROM was designed, wasn't it like late 81?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I recall a party when we celebrated that.
Yep.
First design.
I don't remember that.
Could be. I don't know.
I remember
there
just
was.
having
So,
a two-page
but
data
Ron,
sheet.
you were selling ROMs before there was a design, right? I mean,
Exactly, even before
no
the
need
design.
to actually have the product before
We
you sell
didn't
it.
even have the product. The
Smoke
gentleman
and
that we
mirrors.
ended up hiring later on, Mac Wilson, in a passing conversation, mentioned that a company was looking to buy a lot of ROMs and wanted a new supplier, and that was Mattel. And Mattel was going to go into the cartridge business, very similar to what Atari was doing. And that's how this whole ROM business started then at VLSI. Should I continue on with the story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's an interesting story. So I convinced, I believe, Phil Su and his group to come up with a two-page data sheet. And I went down to Mattel, and they refused to see me. So I ended up spending all day in the lobby.
Well, you're in the wrong building for one thing.
Well, probably the wrong building to start off, but ultimately ended up getting to the right building, getting to know all of the admin people and the receptionist, who after the second day when I was there started to feel a little bad for me. And somewhere around 2 o'clock that following day, the second day I was there, the operations manager was in. She had me sitting out in front of the office where he was residing, and she says, "Okay, Ron, go into the office right now, tell him why you're here." And that's how I went in. He gave me 10 minutes. I threw down the data sheet. I said, "We're a ROM supplier. We've got exactly the product that you want." And 10 days later, they came up and visited us.
That was quite a story, because you were
used
in
the
the Granger building.
And they thought we were
The Granger
much
building
bigger.
is just a random office building in Silicon Valley. It's nothing.
But we were sharing office space. We had, what, a couple hundred square feet? Or,
Yeah.
And-
but it looked like we
know,
owned the
it
whole
was serious,
place, right?
Yeah.
We had a
Telecom
cafeteria.
company.
Yeah, and it was a lot of employees, a few parking lot. And so whenever they arrived, they never even saw a Granger. They just saw VLSI, and they went, "Wow, this is a big company." And they were really impressed.
When was this?
This was
Early '82.
Yeah, early '82. Yeah, and
So I kept hiding. I didn't want to have to sit down and tell the truth to this guy. He keeps going, well, he's there someplace. I don't know where he is.
Was that when he had the VP of purchasing up?
Yeah.
that's when we had the VP of purchasing up.
Okay.
Yeah.
They had this guy spun around. And what was the size of that first order? 18, 19 million, 20 million?
I don't know if it was that large, but it was at least $10 million, and it just
No,
continued
we
to
shipped
grow.
20 the first year.
Right.
The first 8 months, we shipped 20.
Which was remarkable. That
Right.
wasn't that the fastest growth
Oh,
for a semiconductor?
ROM wasn't even a prototype yet, was it, Dan or
No.
Gunnar? I mean,
No.
and besides that, Mattel had a real thin cartridge, so we had to invent a new package for the ROM.
Right.
Otherwise, it wouldn't fit into the slot.
How did that all come together?
Well, Dan, Gunnar?
Dan?
It was
God,
Gunner's
I screwed
group.
all the time.
No, I can't speak to the package. You got to help me here.
What about the ROM itself? What was do you remember anything about the time frame of that? And
Well, Mark Ebel was the
Yeah, Mark.
the chief designer on the,
Right.
the 32K, and which was the first one, and as he said, he made the design the most robust it could be, in terms of operating margins. So therefore, it was very yield insensitive to
Right.
what went on and Ricoh in terms of compatibility with their process and later with our own process technology.
Well, I think those are the wafers that you brought back from Rico, weren't they?
Oh, is that right, Greg? You were there? Ah,
so we took an order before the ROMs were designed. Once the ROMs were designed, we put them into a fab that we had.
We were the first customer.
We were the first customer of.
Right.
And we ended
Invented
up
a package.
and invented a package that didn't exist before.
Well, wasn't the slot that it was going into a different size than what you had originally understood?
different than the Atari slot. Yeah, it was
Uh-huh.
like half height.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had to invent a way to recess the die and then put polyimide over the top so it wouldn't contaminate.
So Dan, was your group responsible for the packaging and getting that done?
I think a big part of it. I think Gunner's group came up with a polyimide, right?
Well, we had some things related to being compatible with
gonna say
that
Howard, yeah.
in terms
A lot of time.
of surface passivation and the way in which the scribe line could be protected so we didn't have migration into the edge of the die. There was a lot of different, nooks and crannies to this. Anytime you make a leap like that, but I didn't have any direct involvement with
Well, I
the package
think-
development. Was that? That must have been under Howard.
That was
wasn't it?
Howard
That
Robinson.
was under Howard.
Which
and
is
Howard.
But he reported to one of you.
He what?
Hey, anyway, in 9 months flat, we shipped $20 million worth of product in 9 months flat from the start to the last shipment.
Well, the interesting
You
part
had
is
90-day terms, and we were getting paid in
We were
10.
Yeah, that flipped the cash. Well, Kenny will know. That flipped the cash flow, I think, $4 million or $5
Ken's
million.
good negotiating here. But, we did design work in San Jose. We had the wafers built in Japan at Ricoh,
Yeah.
and wafers tested in Japan, shipped them over to Korea, where they cut up the wafers, packaged them, tested them, and then we shipped them out from there. Well, most of the Apple ones went to Singapore. I don't know where the Mattel ones went. I don't remember.
I remember you in LA.
Where did we ship Mattel?
Mattel, I think the final product was going on the Far East. It was going
it must have-
through Hong Kong, I believe.
Yeah, so we had this virtual company. We didn't. We needed a lot of logistics, and we.
A lot of frequent flyer miles.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
we were
Larry
sending
Lowe,
people all over.
Greg, our guys lived on 747s there for about 9 months. Carrying pretending wafers were samples for the customs guy. That's a lot of
Ray
samples.
Mack, Ray Mack, Larry Lowe, Phil
Yeah, Ray
Sue,
Mack, yeah.
And Howard.
and Howard Robinson.
Ron just brought up Apple. Apple was also an early customer.
Yeah, there was a
Tell
point where we'd done a lot of that work with Steve. Matter of fact, when Steve Jobs quit Atari, the first meeting he had, it was 20 minutes after he quit. He was in my office at Synertech to talk about this new company he was going to do with his buddy Wozniak, who was still working at HP. And Al Alcorn had called over to say this young kid was coming over. We should really talk to him. He was pretty smart. I said, you don't have to call me. And we talked to anybody. It's, well, you're going to tell the secretary at the front desk there, because the guy's got the saffron robes and their hair. Couldn't tell the last time he showered. So anyway, we went way back to Steve that far. So then we're off. We hadn't seen him probably in 2 years or 3 years. And on the cover of Electronic Design Magazine, here's Steve got an interview about Apple, and here's the Meade Conway book on his desk.
In the photograph.
In the photograph on the cover. So, give Steve a call. He said, yeah, you guys doing that? Absolutely, we are. So that kind of got it going. But then we started hiring people from Xerox PARC, because Doug knew all the good engineers over there. So we're kind of taking turns. And then a day comes where Steve calls up and says, can we keep raising the price for this one chap? Yeah, really good one. And Jobs calls up and says, if you keep this going, we're never going to buy any silicon from you guys, ever. So
We had a bidding war over an engineer that Apple was trying to hire and we were trying to hire. And so Jack said we had to give up.
We had to
and
give
let
up.
Jobs win that one.
The guy never knows he got auctioned off for a bunch of ROMs.
So then there was some chips that we were designing for Apple. There was bagpipe, and
Yeah.
I know there's some very rich stories around that design.
Right. So in 1982, when the ROM guys were doing their magic and generating all this revenue, Jobs put a challenge down to us to design a chip that would integrate all of the random logic in the yet to be announced Macintosh. So this is 1982. Mac didn't appear until '84, but actually at that time their goal was to announce it in early '83. And so this was, in less than a year when he came to us and said, if you guys can design a chip that will integrate all this logic, we'll put it into the first Macintosh. And it turns out that their real goal was they couldn't meet some of the critical display specs with their random logic solution, and so they really wanted to have a custom logic solution that would meet these display specs as well as reduce the cost and profile of the machine. And so we said, sure, we can do that. And just like Ron said, sure, we can do that. Of course, he didn't have the ROMs and we didn't have the tools, but we were going to go do it anyway. And so we put together a team combining a couple of engineers from Apple as well as a number of people at VLSI. And as these things go, perhaps different than ROMs like they had done before, it's bigger and harder and takes longer, and the tools are more complicated than you think, and so forth. So the chip ended up taking longer to do, and in the process of somewhere along the way, it turns out Apple had figured out how to achieve their display performance specifications without this custom chip. So they were thinking, okay, we really don't need this custom chip. We can do what we need to do. The price reduction issue is not a major piece. So as we were sort of finishing this chip up, they had already made the decision that, we aren't going to go that way anyway. Well, they didn't tell us that. And we finished the chip, and the sort of good news, bad news is the chip functionally worked. It did have a performance issue that could have been fixed within a very quick time, a couple of weeks turnaround for mass and a couple of weeks for fab, and we probably could have had an operational chip. But by then, Apple had decided that they were going to go a standard logic solution. So that was a major blow to all of us. We had invested a huge amount of time and effort, a lot of late nights and weekends to do this. And it was one of those bets that was probably worthwhile. If we had been able to get a custom chip into to integrate the first Mac, it would have had a huge impact not only on Apple and future generations of Macintosh, but also on people designing similar types of machines in the future and the use of custom logic in that. But it didn't work out. They went ahead with their standard solution. The good news is that Apple came back and became a major customer of us for custom chips for a number of different products, their printers, computers, and other things along the way. So Apple did end up being a major customer of ours, and there's a famous story about Jobs' interactions with VLSI and some famous sales meeting in which he called our sales force or whoever was in the room some profane names, and basically threatened to never do business with us unless we delivered these products on time. And I think we actually figured out how to get those products on time. But we certainly got to experience all the good and the bad of Steve Jobs. But we ended up making a lot of money from ROMs and custom chips off of Apple. They were certainly a lead customer of ours for a number of years.
And in the meantime, we designed in the ROMs into Coleco, which was another game company. I remember flying back with a couple Cabbage Patch dolls for Valerie, I think.
It was.
They were like, and somebody on the airplane knew I had them, and it was like, man, they were going to hold me ransom to get the Cabbage Patch dolls. You couldn't get them anywhere. And we did ROMs for another company that maybe many of you don't remember it. Remember Kurzweil? And he did the first electronic piano. He did it for Stevie Wonder. I think we had 64 sets of 32K ROMs in that first piano, and we had to deliver them all in exact sets to meet that specification of that. And that was an interesting piece of business also, that we got a lot of publicity out of it back in those days. So,
Coleco, I remember jumping ahead a little bit. Ron and I were at Coleco the day we had the IPO. And
they're all celebrating with champagne.
Yeah, we called back in. There's a rain thunderstorm. We're in the airport at Hartford, which is like an old Quonset hut from World War II. Shattering, you can hear the thunder knocking down the walls. We're on the payphone, everybody, champagne, we're out there. The plane takes off.
A little plane, too.
A little plane. We're going to die for sure. It was pointed down for 45 minutes it took to get to Boston. But somehow we made it. But I'll never go back to Hartford again.
But I did many times.
You did. Well, you're good at that.
So that was 1982. There were, as well as the Apple project, there were a number of other companies that we were starting to engage with in terms of teaching VLSI design courses, getting people started in custom IC design, and then the ROM business just exploded.
When did we start with Olivetti? When did Olivetti come in and start designing?
It must
That's
have been
another
82
interesting
as
story.
well.
I think we got the contract in 81, but I think they started the design centers, and it might have been 82. The design centers, I think, started in 82.
And you also, at that time, I believe it was 82, we bought our first VAX for doing the design.
No, we bought our first, we couldn't do anything in the design tools until we had a VAX, so we actually purchased it as soon as we got funding in December of 80. As soon as January of 81, we were out to purchasing a VAX, and
that was
so,
the first, wasn't it? Weren't we one
and
of
that
the
was the first. No, it wasn't the first VAX, but it was.
but first company to use it for doing design tools.
It was probably the first one for doing it for design, for that level of design tools. People had been using it for simulation, so. Yeah, we had to get that. Had to get a special room built. Had to get it installed. We were starting to hire engineers. I guess we were doing time sharing work until we could get our own VAX installed. But basically, during '81, we were in the process of developing design tools and teaching design courses, and really weren't generating a lot of revenue other than from the design courses. And selling videotapes. We were selling the videotapes that we made at Hewlett Packard. That actually was a nice little side business.
And Debbie used to manage that.
Yeah, and Debbie Hungerford, and and then by 1982 things really got cooking. The ROMs were in production. We were starting to do some serious designs on the design tools, and the activity really picked up during 1982.
Well, can you tell us more about the design tools, because you took a different approach? And some of the team that you had, Steve Trimberger, and there was a whole bunch of the guys, and
Different than LSI, you mean?
Totally different. They were doing ones and zeros still,
Right.
and you were going into the whole new methodology of design methodology.
We were starting from scratch in terms of developing a whole new family of tools that hadn't been done before, that were more well suited to what had been called the VLSI or Meade-Conway design methodology. And that was a methodology really focused on sort of top-down design, architecturally driven design. That is, systems engineers envisioning what they really wanted to do from a functional point of view, and then looking for the most efficient ways to map those into silicon circuits, as opposed to starting from the bottoms up, developing gate level kind of components. So we were developing a lot of parameterized sort of miniature silicon compilers, ROM generators, RAM generators, data path generators, other things that could be used to generate major sections of the layout, as well as developing tools that could be used in a more standard cell kind of approach for random logic kinds of things. We were doing place and route tools. We had taken on a huge challenge in terms of having to develop a whole family of tools using a methodology that had never really been tried out before. So it was a challenge, whereas LSI Logic and many others were focused in the gate array business and using more traditional design methods and traditional design tools. They were quite successful using that path too. It was a quicker startup path. They didn't have to teach people how to do the design really. They could use a methodology they were familiar with. And so people who were really just wanted to integrate random logic, that was an effective way to do it. For people who wanted to do architecturally driven design and really do fundamentally new stuff, then they wanted to use an approach such as what we did.
Well, wasn't that when you started getting the system designers more involved in the chip design, and the system was starting to go onto the chip?
Right. So that was the whole strategy, was to take to teach system designers enough about IC design so that they could actually sort of be tall, thin men, as we called them. That is, that they could cover this whole spectrum from system design down to physical design. And there were some who could literally span that whole gamut. There were others who could fit better into one part of that or one phase of the design or the other. But it really did have a revolutionary impact on the really what was happening in the IC industry. And I think a couple of examples really tell that. I think even before VLSI was formed, a well-known entrepreneur named Jim Clark used the design tools we developed at Xerox PARC to create his first silicon geometry engine, which became the founding chip or the starting chip for Silicon Graphics, which is a major company in the graphics business. And he used that methodology and that approach to essentially get that company off the ground. The work that was done at Stanford, Berkeley, and eventually at ARM in terms of RISC processors, all of those designs were done using Meade-Conway methodology and Meade-Conway educated people looking at how can we create a computer architecture which is more efficient and is mappable into silicon in a much more efficient way. So that's just two examples in terms of how this methodology and getting engineers engaged in the whole IC design process fundamentally changed the path of what was happening in the systems business. We've got RISC computers, we got integrated graphics kinds of technology. A lot of the early telecom companies came to us to start integrating their work, and so there are a lot of these new companies developing very complex systems that use this technology in one form or another, or use the people who'd been educated in that to create the systems which revolutionized the business in the 90s and the 21st century.
Oh, and Lynn Conway was teaching courses.
Okay, so the whole Meade-Conway design methodology had really started at Xerox. It got its name from Lynn Conway and Carver Meade, who collaborated to write the book Introduction to VLSI Systems. That happened in 1978 after Carver had taught a course on VLSI design at Xerox in '76. So we had worked together for a couple of years and eventually decided that we needed a book to kind of help propagate this new approach to IC design. So Carver and Lynn collaborated to do this book, and in order to sort of prove it all out, in the fall of '79, Lynn took a leave and went to MIT to teach a course based on this book to students at MIT, including some of the professors that were there, sat in on the course. And so Lynn is sort of a very exacting person, and so she kept perfect lecture notes of every lecture she had, and had her students design chips, which were later fabbed to prove the efficacy of the process. And so she came back from this 1-quarter course at MIT with some working chips, a set of lab notes, or a set of lecture notes that told anybody who wanted to teach this course what you said on what day, a book that was newly printed by McGraw-Hill, I think, and then some videotapes that we had created along the way as well. And it turns out this technology was one that excited a lot of other people. And so first we started with universities nearby, such as Stanford and Berkeley. Professors from there would come and sort of pick up this package that Lynn had created and sit with us and sort of get indoctrinated, and then take it back and with these lecture notes and book teach a course on VLSI design. And so within a couple of years, Lynn sent this package out to, I think, over 200 universities around the world. And as a result, there were thousands of engineers being educated in the early 80s in this methodology from every significant university in the United States, as well as many foreign universities. And so through this, this incredible technology transfer mechanism, there was a huge amount of activity and huge amount of interest that got generated. And VLSI eventually was able to ride that wave. As I said earlier, it took a while to kind of get that going. And right. So, having the ROM business early on to create a basis of revenue was a critical part of VLSI's financial and overall corporate success. So I think we want to sort of move on to the 1982. We were doing the bagpipe chip. We were generating all this ROM business. And I'm going to turn it back to Jack to kind of tell that. We
got funded in December 12th of 1980. And we had insisted on $10 million up front this time, having done Synertech 7 years earlier, with only $750,000 to go compete with Intel and people like that. That was pretty hard, and so this time we wanted to overkill it and go for the 10 million, which we did. Yeah, it came in December of 80, and I remember the first board meeting, probably the first day, probably December 13th, and I suggested, I don't think we needed a CFO for quite a while because not much is going to happen for at least a year. So they still wanted to get one tomorrow, since none of us had really managed that kind of money before. So we put out the feelers. And actually, I think it was a friend of Dan's, Alan Gregory, who suggested that a young guy used to work for him at Fairchild. Yeah. And he kind of lost track of him, but he knew he was over at Memorex now, a guy named Ken Goldman. So somehow we ended up getting Ken's phone number. And got a hold of him.
That was before email.
Before email, yeah. Yeah,
and cell phones.
Yeah, or anything.
Yeah.
So we had a quick meeting with Ken, cup of coffee, and in the meeting I was talking about how these startups are so hard. You really can't have people join you if they have any kind of marital problems at all, because the stress will just break up a marriage, and we don't want to do that. So he's over there going, I couldn't agree more. He's saying, I can imagine how hard they are. So he invited me to a Christmas party at his house just to show how solid his whole thing was. So wife and I went there, Marnie and I went there. Wow, look at this. This is a very happy party. Everybody's smiling. And good. So that's a checklist. We don't have to worry about that for Ken. Well, I find out years later he was living in the Oak Mead apartments the whole time. His whole party must have been. There must have been hired actors.
Nice house, wasn't it?
Huh?
It was a nice house.
Nice house. I didn't know it was his house.
I want to know whose house it was.
Well, it doesn't matter because 85 went on top of it.
And they crushed
They crushed it, yeah. It was behind the golf range, driving range.
I remember being at a couple parties there.
Yeah, we did a couple parties. Oh, you went to a couple?
Oh, yeah, yes.
And so, it turns out to be, it was bulldozed.
Yeah, well, lucky for us, we didn't go with that checklist.
We didn't follow it.
Kenny turned out to be a whiz-bang guy, as we all know.
So when did he join?
So you were employee number 7 or 6? Or?
I was number 7. I joined in, we talked in December of 80. I joined in March of 81.
Yeah.
So, first time there.
Had to do the payroll on a touch-tone phone, as I recall. We didn't have our computers yet.
Well, if you want to go there, yeah, the old days were quite different. We used 17, 18 columns, not spreadsheets, even green paper. So we did our accounting. I did all the accounting, did the payroll. But it's actually very good because you learn. The best way to learn is do it yourself. So you did your payroll, you did accounts payable. I did the general ledger. Involved in hiring at that time involved, not necessarily hired, but I involved in hiring every single employee. You ever talk about the Mark Ebel story?
No.
Oh,
No,
geez.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
That was a great story. No, so one of the jobs
Mark
I had
Ebel was one of the ROM designers.
Yeah.
We mentioned him. We didn't mention
critical
him.
designer, critical guy, worked for Phil Sue. But he was early on, and I was involved all the jobs I had, one of which was HR, human resources. So Mark would try to hire from National Semi. So he comes over and says, yeah, I'm all in, yeah, here's the offer, yeah, I accept, I handshake, I sign it. Goes back to National. They convince him, no, you can't, Mark, you can't leave, you gotta stay. So he says, sorry, he calls me up, says, sorry, I can't come. Mark, come on, yeah, come over, try one more time. Let's come over, I come over, we did a little extra, come on, Mark, he signs again. He says, yeah, man, I'm all in. He goes back there, they convinced him again. Yeah. So I don't know if you all remember this. So he comes back one last time, and I said, Mark, we're done with this. Give me a badge. I took his badge, and we were done.
His national semi badge.
True story. I took his badge, and he never went back, and that's how we got Mark Ebel.
Threw that in the trash can.
So,
And without Mark, we wouldn't have had the 32K ROM.
So that was, he was our number 2 designer after Phil, right?
Oh, yeah.
So,
I think Phil would say probably the
small
cream of the
group
crop.
of,
Mark
Well, in the memory side, we had Bill Smithson, who
For
was
Logic,
the Logic design guy, and he was not only helped support the development of all the I/O circuits and stuff for the library, the design library, but he also did some circuits that were put into production as well.
Yeah.
You might be able to help me on that, Ron.
If it wasn't for Bill, we got one of the first circuits that we actually put into production, that was a custom circuit, was for Williams Electronics in Chicago,
right.
for the gaming business.
That's right.
And
We
Bill
love
Smith-
those games.
We love those games. Yeah. Well, because they were willing to take the risk a little easier than some of the computer companies, and we designed that custom circuit. And Bill Smithson was very, very critical to the design, and we did that, and that thing shipped for many years into Williams for all of their pinball and arcade games.
Yeah.
Well, the truth in any startup is there's always a very few people that you need, and you need them to get the job done. And so, circuit design is just a few good designers, so to speak. Whether it's Phil or Mark, whether it's Bill, and some of the you don't need a ton of people, but you need some very, very good people.
Good people.
And that's what that's made a lot of difference.
Yeah.
It's like the old story about if you want to win the high jump, you don't want 7 guys that can jump 1 foot. You want 1 guy who can jump 7 feet, right? And that applies to a great many things in high tech.
So how do we, when Ron booked that order for, we did 20 million in ROM deliveries in 82 in 8 or 9 months. How do we keep track of the cash? I think you told me that actually generated cash for us.
Well, after we finished paying the commission.
Another story we never heard before.
Ron always made sure we got that address up front. But now
Before you close the books.
No, it was no, it was actually it was a lot of people were involved in that, but we had 2 things going for us. One is we were able to get the customers. Well, first of all, we negotiated payment terms. So we were dealing with all these folks in the Far East, and so we agreed to pay them in 90 days.
Right.
And then the customers were effectively in the Far East as well, but we agreed to get letters of credit from them, so they actually paid us on site.
On site.
So we were getting paid at the time we shipped, which is basically 0 days, and we were paying for basically the product in 90 days. So Jack is absolutely right. We were creating working capital every time we shipped. So it was a great capital efficiency story. And I don't know if you covered this, but we effectively, the company only had 1 round of financing when we went public. I mean, I guess we'll come back a little public, but to my knowledge, we only had really 1 round of financing. That was original 10 million. Jack alluded to this, but the fact that he had 10 million, the good part about that is it gave everybody confidence that we had the funding, and so employees coming in could really rest assured that the funding was there, the financing was there, and so forth, didn't have to worry about it. So it gave us a real head start. We had the one round. We then had Bendix come in and Olivetti come in from some equipment financing, which really created our fab. But we didn't do any other quote-unquote venture round. We had one venture round, Fund A, if you will. Then we can talk about, we want to move on, talk about how we went public.
Yeah. Talk about the IPO?
Yeah, I think we're ready to go on to the IPO story. It was incredible, and we led the way. There hadn't been any IPOs for a while, and there's Bill Hambrick knowing that
August
this
82
was the
meeting.
right time to push the button, and
Yeah.
I think Jack and Ken can.
Well, Ken could tell that story. We all walked into that meeting.
Well, it's interesting how that worked. We went through the customary board presentations, update by all the folks in this table in terms of sales and R&D and operations, and so a full board meeting as you would expect. Jack started and so forth, and then we got around to talking to financing, and this is a part that probably most don't remember, but I remember well. And I don't know what was wrong with me, but I actually was going to Tahoe that night, and I thought the meeting was effectively over. So when I left, I know you, Dan, you may remember this. When I left, we were going to do a private round just to sort of, add some extra dough and whatever to the kitty, so to speak, even though we really didn't need it. So I left, hopped on a plane, headed on to Tahoe, called Jack, I don't know, about 7:38 that night, and said, Jack, how'd the rest of the meeting go? And Jack said, "Oh well, we had a little change. We're not going to do another private round. We're going to go public, and we're going to be the first ones out in 83. So this was again August of '82, and Bill, and this is absolutely true story, had the sense. I think the market was 800. Dow was something like 800, whatever.
It's Bill Hambrick.
Bill Hambrick, and so had the sense that he called it one of the greatest calls of ever, that the market was poised to turn. And we ought to be the first ones out. And so instead of doing a private round, we ought to get out and make our name for ourselves and really position ourselves well. And so we hit absolutely 180 on me. I called Jack and said, no, we're not going to do a private round, we're going to do a public. And so the goal then, it's funny, it's just the same as today. The goal then was to finish off the next 2 quarters, do the best we could, obviously, and then be literally the first ones out. And I think we filed something like, I actually still have the great tombstones, a phenomenal tombstone, because we filed like January 17th, 18th. We got our numbers done really, really quickly. Had them reviewed by Ernst & Young was our auditors, and I still actually keep in touch with our audit partner, was Sue James, so I know her very well. So we got our, we wanted to be the first out, because one of the goals we had was to get out before LSI Logic, and so that we could clearly position ourselves as the leader. And one of the ways of positioning the leader is you be out there first. So our goal was to get out there before LSI. Bill and H&Q were investors in our company. Turns out our great friends Klein and Perkins, they were invested, both us and LSI Logic. Now, John Doerr, who was involved as as an observer. So he was not on our board, and so we wanted to keep all this confidential. So, sorry, John, you can't be at our board meetings right now, And so, because we didn't want LSI going out before us, we actually went out. We got filed in January. We went out in like February. It was amazing how quickly.
Very quickly.
Like 4 weeks we were out in public, and it was a great offering. We priced it, as I recall, at 13. It went up a bit from there. And I always remember this, and it's sort of the way, I sometimes tell the story, the way investors think. And I remember being at one of our roadshow lunches, and when you go public, you have both general meetings with a number of investors, which you may do over lunch or breakfast, and then you have a bunch of one-on-ones with institutions. Well, we were at this one lunch, and the guy leans over to me and says, "Oh, VLSI, you guys must be better than that company. I heard LSI." I said, "Why do you think that?" "Well, because you're VLSI and they're LSI." And so that gives you some sense sometimes of how much people understand of technology, which means you really want to be out there first and get the brand awareness, and which we did. And so we did it was a great job. We got out there. The other thing is, you guys were talking about the ROMs and so forth, but it was, here was a company that was started on the basis of really three, in my opinion, transformations, which really always attracted me in terms of a company that's not a Me Too company like so many companies are, but really a transformative company. And we effectively, as Doug talked about, is created the VLSI and CAD business. We created the ASIC business, and we created the foundry business. And so there were really three new businesses that totally emanated from VLSI Tech. And so it wasn't just one of these another Me Too, this, that. So, but having said all that, 80-90% of our revenues were coming from ROMs, but 80-90% of the S1 was ASICs, because ASIC sells, ROMs brings the cash in.
And we had a whole color section in the
Doug was the sizzle,
brochure.
and the rest of these guys were the meat.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you need to make an IPO work. You need both the beef and the sizzle, and so they both are really required to. And we had both, and we had a very, very successful roadshow actually.
Well, it was a very intense time. I remember we worked around the clock. We would work until 11, 12 o'clock at night. Many times during the week, we worked on weekends. I remember one weekend, it was raining very hard. It flooded, and we were in the McKay building, in the only conference room we had at that time. And the water level came up so high, the water table, that the floor started flooding, and we had to pick up all of our stuff that was on the floor and keep our feet off the floor because there was water in the conference room. And it was Dan Case was there, and I think Ann Hayes was there from LF Rothschild.
She was great.
And there were several other people. I can't remember. You were in the meeting, and I'm sure Doug was there. And there were quite a few meetings like that were pretty intense. That was the meeting when Al wouldn't buy sandwiches for us. And we worked all day Saturday. And so Dan Case he went and ordered the sandwiches so we could eat because we were working. those were funny days.
I don't think we need to go there.
Anyway.
But Geri, you bring up a good point because how the world in banking has changed, because the professional that Bill was, he could have argued to be the lead. He did not. He thought his position would be best on the right side of the offering, and so he.
That's on the front page of the offering sheet.
So as the lead banker, the book runner, so he suggested a few of us go out and interview bankers. We went to New York. Several of us at this table went there, and we interviewed folks like LF Rothschild, like Lehman Brothers, like Morgan Stanley, and so forth. And we really did like LF Rothschild a lot. Bill was very fine to. They were bigger than H&Q. To have them be the lead left. They did a great job. You mentioned Ann Hayes, and you're right. But we had Tommy Underberg.
Tommy Underberg.
Yeah, Tommy, and I remember when Jack and I were with him. I don't know if you remember this, Jack. When we cemented a deal with them, we had some Rice Krispies at breakfast with him. Yeah, so it was he was a. By the way, he's still that guy. That old geezer's still working. He's 80 something, whatever. He's still out there working. But
Jack or Tommy?
Tommy Underberg. Jack. Well, that's another story for the day. But no, Tommy is still out there. But he was. He personally worked on our deal, and some of his other guys, Jim Furneaux, remember that name? Was another name?
I remember Jim.
And so we had a great, I don't remember the research folks anymore, but
that bubble lasted only about 4 months. And if you didn't get public in that bubble, and some
lasted
people
from February to June.
Yeah, 5 months.
And LSI went public, and
in June, and then it pretty much closed off. Yeah, it was a. It's all about timing, and we because the market was up and down, and we picked a great time. I always tell people you want to go out before the wave crests. We went out when the wave was just getting going, and so we hit an opportune time. We had a great offering, and we had it was changed because first of all, LF Rothschild doesn't exist, H&Q doesn't exist.
Right.
But we had probably
Lehman
60,
doesn't
70 syndicate folks involved in our offering. Today, it's just not the way. Today, you may have 4, 5, 6 people involved. Whole different world. And but getting us public really helped us a lot. I think I found that good companies do better when they go public. We did better when we went public. We really executed well. We grew. And as I said, the company really was transformative relative to the new industries that we effectively created that hadn't existed before VLSI Tech existed.
And so overall, how much did we raise on the IPO?
Oh boy, I remember that.
65.
Is that 65?
About 65.
Very good.
But the amazing part of that was we went out with a valuation of 10 times sales, which was really unheard of because a typical company was maybe 4 times or something like that.
Yeah, we went out for valuation of $300 million, as I remember, and we did $33 million of the revenue that year.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and not profitable. So
That's right.
those are numbers that wouldn't fly so well.
Yeah, no. We have a hard time getting $300 million today for evaluation. Never mind 82, 83. So no, it was again, you need both. You need the ROMs gave us a base of business that we could say we're a real company. We use that to prove our systems work, and so that our invoicing systems, our collections, our manufacturing. So that's what really got the company up and running. Because you say 10 times sales, but if you did 10 times our ASIC sales or our CAD sales, that would have been an awfully small number. So the fact that we had the ROMs driving the ship, you allowed to get the 10 times. But the fact of the matter is, what people bought into was the ASIC business and the CAD business. That's what got us the hefty,
LSI
hefty evaluation.
they'd only done $5 million in sales the year we did 22. I think they kind of got into our draft and got sucked into the IPO crowd.
They thanked VLSI for being first because we did all the education of the marketplace and what, they didn't have to explain as much. We'd been the pioneers, and so it made it easier for them to do their IPO. One of the other things that I was always...
They drafted on us.
They did draft on us, you're
They
absolutely
only
right.
had 5 minutes sales. You're not going to go public.
Oh, there was one other thing. Larry Sonsini was one of the advisors on the IPO, and Greg Pickerel was our attorney at Wilson Sonsini. And interestingly enough, Larry was on the board at LSI at the same time. I mean, it was an interesting relationship he had with both companies.
Larry was on our board, you're right. He was on our cover of S1. You're absolutely right. Greg was the partner that was involved directly with us.
Yeah.
And he is actually still actively working, so as Larry is as well. Larry's as good as ever and as active as ever. And we were actually one of the very few, so even though he's on the door of his firm, the reality is we were one of the very few first companies that he was involved in going public. So we were very important to him in terms of helping to establish his career.
When we went over to Larry to have him be our lawyer for VLSI, they had 13 lawyers in the firm at that time. And we talked him into taking us on. We started out with John Friedenrich, but he just had personally made about $50 million selling a company called Cume, I think it was, a printer company.
Yeah.
He could tell he was not into being a lawyer anymore. John. So we dropped him and went over to Larry. I remember it clear, it was about 13 lawyers, that was it.
I didn't
And Mabel
realize it
used to
was
sit
so
there with
small.
her cigarette. He'd call, she'd okay, just a minute, put the phone down, smoking away, typing. As soon as Larry, was off the phone, she'd hook you right through. But no automated anything, no voicemail, just Mabel.
Yeah.
Giving her cigarettes.
We also had a really strong board. I mean, Bill Hambrick was on the board. Bill Perry was on the board.
Yeah.
I was very impressed with the caliber of board we had.
Yeah, Dave Evans,
Dave
classy
Evans.
guy.
I
Well,
can't.
one more I think on the board too.
Well, John Doerr was on the
QT
board
was-
too.
No,
Oh,
John was, QT was on.
QT, certainly.
Yeah, he was on the board. John was not on the board. John was an observer.
He wasn't on the board?
No,
He
was
just
on
came
the
to
board
the
of
meeting?
LSI Logic, and he was observer, so
Yeah.
we only allowed him to be in.
I know, we threw him off.
Yeah.
So
But we had QT Wiles and but Perry, who also still active, working at Stanford, he was phenomenal in terms of advice.
Yes.
Dave Evans too. We had Dave Evans,
Right.
Yeah.
Evans Sutherland, Bill Perry, as you said,
Bill,
QT
Undersecretary
Wiles.
of Defense
I
of
wrote
the
at that.
country.
Bill Hambrick, who was Bill, is all you don't need to say anymore.
Yeah.
And so it was but Dave really brought the business experience from Evans Sutherland. Bill brought the financing experience, Bill Hambrick, that is. Bill Perry also, I think, was also involved in a company as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
He was
a variety of companies,
TRW,
yeah.
I think, right?
Which one?
He was TRW.
No, he had his own
No, it was
company.
another
up here.
company. It was one
ES,
they made.
ESL?
Started with
ESL, yes.
Yeah.
ESL. So he was CEO of ESL. So he was both in government and operating roles. And so you're right, the board was very, very helpful.
How did you attract such a strong board?
Well, Bill, Hambrick already had Bill Geri as a special consultant to H&Q. They had a separate fund, Hambrick and Quist Technology Partners, I think it was called. And Bill was one of the partners in that. So they would consult for GE, maybe they'd give them $10 million to study what should GE do in the future. So had a big study group out here. So he knew Perry. And QT, of course, was Bill's turnaround guy.
Yeah.
They'd turned around about 10 or 12 companies. And when Bill wouldn't give us the funding, the 10 million, unless we agreed to hire a chairman who would teach us how to manage the company. And so we tried Don Valentine. He said no. We didn't know that Valentine was doing LSI Logic. And finally, we really had to almost beg QT, right? He didn't really want to do it. He was busy doing Granger.
Yeah.
And so we talked him into it, little guy, and just had
Squatty guy.
little wide guy.
Yeah.
Scare people to death, that guy. And he was great.
Well, the company started in his quarters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about that.
Yeah.
But he was hardly ever around. I mean, you never saw him.
QT's
during
approach
the-
was he was based, was it Palm Springs?
Yeah.
He was based there,
Yeah.
and he always had his top three. That's how he ran everything. And so every quarter, both, all of us would have our top three, and so when he would come to review what we're doing, it was always the top three. That's the way he ran things, and it was always top three for that quarter, and then you start a new quarter, and that was the way he sort of quasi-micromanaged the company, but in terms of what you had to go do, and then he's basically stayed out of our way.
Well, he was great on operational things. Like when I talked to him about bringing Ron in, or any salesperson, a year ahead of the schedule. They just a plan they just bought off on. Bring him in a year ahead of time to kind of get involved, especially with Doug and the guys, to figure out what's going on. It was about a 5-minute chit chat, and he'd listen. Yeah, fine, good, let's do it. Anything like that. But if you use his office, which I did once by mistake, for a photograph for Business Week, I think it was. So he could tell that was his office. And his secretary said, why don't you use this instead of your thing in the back? Ballistic, veins popping. Who do you think you are, you? And he had this litany before every chat. It got longer. And
There was a
longer.
protocol.
A protocol, that's what it was.
And you always liked protocol.
You broke protocol.
My favorite thing.
You broke protocol.
We broke protocol.
All of us were in that front little office section in the Granger
Yeah,
building,
right.
packed in there in little cubicles.
Yep.
And there, half the time there weren't even walls. There were just desks next to each other.
Yeah.
I think you had one of those little temporary walls around your office.
Oh, yeah, it's a big shot.
Yeah,
Sure.
you were the president.
Yeah.
Anyway, we were all packed in there pretty tightly together, and we overheard every conversation everybody had on the phone.
Yeah.
Including when I used to do payroll. Because one of the funny things about payroll, when you started it, this was it was B of A system. I don't know, it was bill pay. That was bill. It was some other term, but anyway, it was a payroll we did over the phone, and you had to sort of put all the information by touchpad. And if you stopped at any point, you had to start all over again. And so Jack had this tendency to come, as I'm in the middle of listening to these commands and trying to touch, hey, how's it going? How's the quarter going? I just lost it all. I had to start all over again. And so another half hour ago, because literally every single person, any change, I had to go use a touch-tone phone to, that was our payroll system.
That's why we couldn't give you so much stock. You do it on a touchdown.
You were busy.
So a lot of things happened at VLSI that became kind of the norm today. I mean, the foundries, that's most companies, only a few companies have their own fabs now. Most use foundries. We were an early foundry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had our own. I mean, that was really, that went against the grain.
It really did.
The fact is, we
were a foundry and used other people's foundries.
and we used other people's until we had our own foundry as well. But we created, and we again to finance that, we used equipment financing, guaranteed by Bendix, I recall.
Bendix, yeah.
Bendix.
So they came in and they did the guarantee. So it was very effectively cost-effective and cheap money, and so that allowed us to build it, which we went against the grain because no one builds fabs at this size company.
That was about the last.
We built the fab, and it took
And
us.
how much did it cost to build a fab
I'm
in those
thinking
days?
20 million.
Yeah, 20 or 30.
Yeah,
20 million,
I'm
yeah.
20, and today it costs,
Well, 3 years later, they were 300. I remember that because I went
thinking-
to.
Today they're billions. And so
Billions.
whatever you want to talk about.
2, 3, 4 billion.
Yeah.
It's a B number is all I know. But no,
Well, we weren't the only ones that
built.
built a fab, though. I mean, coming back to LSI for a moment, they didn't have to build a complete fab, and that was one of the advantages, because they only personalized wafers that they purchased from Sony, wasn't it?
no,
in
it's
Japan?
Toshiba.
Toshiba, okay. So they only had to do the
back-end part of it.
personalization layers, and that
Oh,
reduced
for the gate array.
for the
Yeah.
gate array.
Right.
So that
Right.
reduced the size of their fab investment. We on the other hand, Greg and Min, and supplied the technology. Cliff Rowe, who was our fab manager in the beginning anyway. They had a big job to bring up an entire factory, an entire fab area that would produce wafers from beginning to end, and the role of a foundry, not always with technologies that you would choose to run, because sometimes people would come to you with tooling that was already pre-designed. And I had a fellow that I worked with back at AMI, George Steers, I forget his name.
Steers, yeah.
Steers, who did the foundry as a interface to the customers, and also internally into the factory, with our wonderful engineering help, Geri Allison, who was the internal interface to the fab for the products that had been designed elsewhere. And so we did everything that we could to, as QT described the strategic imperative, fill the factory. And of course, ROMs were the biggest part of that, but they're having your own fab area, for better or worse. It's like having the pet dinosaur. If you don't feed it real often, it's going to eat you alive. You have to figure out a way to run it to a large percentage of its capacity, or else you have a big negative. And I don't know when we finally started to break even, Ken, as far
I don't know if
as.
we ever did.
Well, the problem was keeping up with the technology, as Jack mentioned. That every time we got a leg up, and then we'd have to recapitalize the company almost to be able to afford the next round of capital equipment investment. And that's where having a high profit margin products under your own label is so key, and why Intel has been so successful is because they have that 50+% gross margin, and it's almost impossible when you're running 20% or 30% gross margin on your products.
Well, until which took 20 years, but TSMC at one point finally hit, after they'd rubbed out every other foundry on the planet. Their gross margins, they're the biggest foundry in the world, out of Taiwan. And I think their margins are off the charts, just off the charts.
Yeah, just
But if you're small, you
reflecting,
can't do it.
it reminds me of something relative to the ASIC business. When we entered the ASIC business, and our vision was that this was to be a high margin business. You were doing specialized designs for people and you weren't competing with other people offering exactly the same product. But it turned out to be a much bigger challenge in some ways than we had originally anticipated, and required a significantly larger investment than we did. So that was one of the challenges, one of the issues that made it more difficult for VLSI to be profitable in the long term, because as doing ASIC, you not only had to have a reasonably state-of-the-art fast turnaround factory, you also, every customer wanted some sort of different packaging, so you had to have a broader range of packaging availability than you would otherwise do for standard products. And then there was the need for design tools, and it turned out that the path that VLSI and LSI plowed, everybody decided to jump on that path because it looked like the way to go of the future, and so there ended up being quite a bit of a lot of competition in the ASIC business for design wins, and so you would end up having to bid lower prices, give away design tools, lower your prices for production in order to win the business. And it turned out to be a more expensive, more capital-intensive business because it required unique capabilities, design tools, unique processes, unique packaging, unique testing, and other things that a standard product business didn't actually require. So that was a big negative, a big challenge, of the ASIC business. One of the things that VLSI and everybody else that was in the ASIC business struggled with.
Well, and didn't,
But I was going to say, it took a lot of support people to support the customers, and that's how the whole independent design center concept started. That's how distribution got involved, and it took a lot of sales and marketing and technical people in the field to start supporting the customer, to handhold him through that design process. So that was another thing that evolved out of VLSI. We started that whole concept of independent design centers to start feeding in designs to our factory because we couldn't do it all by ourselves. So another thing that was created at VLSI.
and did Jim Lippman set up the design centers, didn't he?
Well,
No, Jim was responsible for some of the training work afterwards.
And Ben Warren came in.
Bill Smithson originally
Bill, yeah.
had a role in that, and then other people took
a lot
on
of
that.
other people, yeah.
But I mean, to Ron's point, we were a pioneer, and
Exactly.
LSI was, came along quickly as well. In order to properly support the ASIC business, you had to have design people that were closer to the customer, and to do the training, to do the support, whatever. And so we ended up establishing an international network of design centers, not only doing chip design, but also we're very early in terms of doing distributing software development. We established a software development group in France very early on, and we're a pioneer in that area. So, but the design center business was definitely one that we took a lead on.
Yeah.
Something else that was unique about the company was, mainly I think you drove this, Doug, we were on email, the whole company, every single solitary employee in the company had an email address by probably 1983.
Well,
and I remember the moment when I realized how important this was, is you were in Germany and I needed to reach you really urgently, and I sent you an email and you answered me within about an hour. and it was just, I was sold right then and there.
Yeah, I have the pleasure of never having a job that didn't have email, and I started in 1972. And I started at Xerox PARC, which was also a pioneer, and so they had email when it was, ARPANET kind of functionality. So when we started, and the universities had it, so when we started VLSI, we couldn't, the engineering people couldn't exist without email. Of course you had email, that was a given. And so we made sure that the company had it. But yes, we were definitely an early adopter in that respect as well.
It was sort of contentious too, because here was Doug trying to get this whole building wired for Ethernet. It cost a lot of money, and it could have gone into fab or could have gone into other things. So nobody was sure what it really did.
I do
And now we
remember
can't
that
imagine
parking
life
because
without
You
it.
can't
the
imagine
wires
life
were
without
pulled
it.
through the ceilings.
You know,
Yeah.
something came along
Forgot about
in
that,
the
yeah.
80s also, and that was programmable logic, and that was it started taking away business from companies like VLSI and LSI, because companies, even though the programmable logic devices were more expensive, they could do them in really small lots.
Yeah, I think they came along really in the late 80s and 90s.
It was late 80s?
And yeah, because I specifically remember thinking we would actually have been better served if they had come along earlier, because there were a lot of designs that went into custom LSI chips that didn't belong there. That
Right.
the only reason they did it was because that was the
There was
only
no other solution.
That was the only solution. If programmable logic had been available earlier, LSI, VLSI, and all the other companies who had jumped into the ASIC business would not have been so tempted, and the customers wouldn't have required, going into that. So we ended up taking a lot of business early on, especially that we didn't, that was not good business, but because we were trying to grow the design base and so forth, we did. So I always felt that even though programmable logic was in some ways a competitor, the company would have been better served if in fact it had come along sooner, because it would have kept us out of a business that we didn't belong in anyway.
And it could have been used for prototyping if.
It could have been used as prototyping and
If
so
you wanted
forth.
to do
So-
high volume and dedicated chips later,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's something else I remember. We had workstations. What was the company that made the
Apollo workstations.
Apollo workstations?
Yeah.
And we had sales guys taking them out on the road. They'd put them in a van.
Scary.
And it was scary. And they were on
And we
wheels,
had to,
and they
and we
would.
had to lug them
We had,
upstairs.
not only that, we took them around Europe from one place to another. That was even more exciting.
Yeah.
But
Get 'em
yes,
set
we
up.
were early adopters on workstations as well, because of course we had the key people had started at Xerox PARC, and we had workstations in 1973, 74. So you couldn't exist without a workstation. So as soon as they were commercially available in '82, we told Jack and Ken that we really had to buy a workstation, even though they were $50,000 a piece. And so we started with Apollo. I think LSI Logic started with Sun. But yeah, we were on the cutting edge of the design tools and workstations.
We actually sold them for a period of time.
And we actually,
We actually
that's right,
sold
we OEM'd the,
OEM.
the workstations
Yep.
as part of our
Anything
design
to make
tool
a buck.
business.
Anything to make a buck, that's true. Yeah, if the customer wanted, we had it for
I
them.
hope if an OEM, I gave you less commission now.
One thing that also was special at VLSI was there was a really strong esprit de corps, and I don't remember who started it, but there were like beer parties on Friday nights, hot dogs and beers, and then
Could've
we
been
had
anybody.
ice cream socials and various things over the years. And how did that all come about? Any of you
I don't remember how it
Ron
started.
drinks too much.
It must have been the
it Ron?
sales guys.
It must have been the bells.
Cowbell.
I'm not too sure.
Oh, yeah, cowbell, yes.
The cowbell, yeah.
Actually, the piece of that I remember and that I'm grateful for and so forth is that given the sort of the state of the engineering world and early product world, you had sort of two different groups. You had these guys that were working on software that had the promise of generating revenue, but were not actually generating revenue. We were sort of doing sizzle, but we weren't doing beef, right?
Right.
And we had the guys who had a totally different, more traditional IC background, who were designing chips on, on vellum and doing digitization and that sort of thing the old way, because the tools weren't up and running yet. So it could easily have evolved into a very split kind of contentious organization where we're generating all the revenue, what are you guys doing? We're doing this and that. But in fact, it blossomed into a very collaborative kind of environment, synergistic environment, where we realized on the software side and VLSI design side that we needed the expertise and appreciated the expertise of these experienced IC designers. And they certainly appreciated the fact that the tools they were using were primitive and awful, and were looking forward to the day that they didn't have to do designs the way they did it. And so it was a very collaborative kind of effort, and the bagpipe chip, for example, was very much that way. It was a collaboration of people from sort of both sides of the engineering people from both sides of the company. And that existed, and that kept on, throughout the company. And I think the other milestone that I remember in that regard in, I don't know, 84, 85, I'm just guessing, was when we sat down, when they realized that the place and route tools and everything was good enough, and we sat down this whole team of layout people. We had more traditional layout people, and we said, we don't need most of you anymore. And there was a very sort of compressed period in which we took these people and trained them to be IT people, to how to support the CAD systems, how to work with the place and route tools, how to do other things within the company, and some of them left the company and did other things. But it was a very distinct period where we said, we need to transition, and these people we don't need those nearly that many anymore. And that was, and it wasn't a contentious period. It was a period in which everybody kind of realized, yep, now's the time, and the tools are now good enough, and it's time to make the transition.
No, because what I was thinking too is the tools opened up many, many customers' doors, even though sometimes we did the design in the old traditional way to get it into production. Mm-hmm. But we would have never gotten in there if it wasn't for the sizzle with the tools. So it was an interesting period.
At that same time, there were the EDA companies, the Daisies, and that's one.
Daisy Mentor Valid.
Daisy Mentor Valid, right. And they were doing just tools, and we were doing tools and foundry and design and on and on. And LSI was in a similar position. And so I'd like to kind of explore that area a little bit.
Yeah, for a long time Daisy, I think, was the first, and Mentor and Valid were all very much focused on design capture at the schematic capture level, and then place and route for printed circuit boards. And so for the first few years, there was very little overlap between what they were doing and what we were doing. We were mainly focused on the back end and in terms of IC design. And so it was later in that cycle when Cadence and others started coming up and offering place and route tools and so forth that were more user-friendly, that it became an issue. And it was a tension within the company for many years in terms of, should we stay in the design tool business? There are these companies that are investing their whole operations and focusing on design tools. And so picking the right time, eventually the answer was no, we shouldn't be doing our own design tools. Picking the right time to do that and picking the way to transition from that was a point of contention, and one that eventually led to my leaving the company, I'd say, after many of the others had already left the company.
True.
But I think it was 88, 89, we at the design tool level decided that it would be better to spin off the design tools. And we had an agreement with Cadence to do a joint venture with Cadence on the design tool side. And we took that to Al Stein, who was the CEO at the time, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted to continue to hold on to it. Later on, and so I had sort of bet that was my strategy. That was what I thought was the right thing for the company to do. And so after Stein decided that wasn't what the company was going to do, I subsequently decided to leave the company along with Jim Rousen, and we went off and formed another company, Redwood Design Automation, which was focused on design tools only. And then meanwhile, the company decided later on to create a subsidiary, which was Compass Design Automation, to try to create a new separate design automation company, which did remarkably well for a while, but eventually it was just too little too late, and that operation was collapsed.
That was one example of something you would have done differently. Are there some other things that thinking back?
Well, one company did real well. I think it was called Artisan. That compete with Compass and got in bed with TSMC and.
Yeah, the Artisan was doing, I think, standard cells and that sort of thing. They were not doing so much of the. But there were a lot of opportunities, and I think if we had done the joint venture with Cadence, it would have been a very different story, because they were still. We had a lot more experience in IC design than they did. but they just had a lot more resources and more focus, and it's a matter of timing, picking the right thing at the right time. But we were, for a long time, we were, viewed as a leader and a pioneer in that VLSI design area, and we had tremendous design tool capability.
Well, I love the company so much, and he's still on the board of what got left over after all these years. Ken. What's it called? NXT?
Oh, you're going down that story, huh? No, it turns out I joined a company called NXP Semiconductor, which is about a $4 billion company that was spun out, a semiconductor company that was spun out of Philips. A number of years ago, it was spun out and financed by a number of private equity investors. It went public about 2 years ago, and I joined the board about then. And the interesting part is Philips had bought VLSI Technology.
Right.
I'm not sure I
Yeah.
remember exactly when, but they bought VLSI after some other potential sales that could have gone through didn't go through. So Philips bought it, and it turns out, small world, that for a long while the U.S. headquarters of NXP was on McKay Drive, of all things. So what goes around comes around. So I'm, as I said, I am on the board of NXP Semiconductor, and one of its components is VLSI Technology, the old VLSI Technology we all love. So
30 years,
and,
40 years
it was
later.
only actually less than a year
30
ago.
30 years later.
Less than a year ago, they got out of the McKay Drive building.
Oh,
Actually
right.
sold it for, and unfortunately sold it for a loss.
Well, they used to float.
Yeah.
Well, one of the last things I wanted to ask you
Yeah,
is...
one of the other things you mentioned, one of the other businesses that we could have been in is
Yeah.
The Olivetti Group was designing a chipset for the PC.
Yeah.
And it was basically almost complete. In typical Olivetti, every 18 months the management changed and
Yeah, it's true.
a whole new strategy occurred at Olivetti,
Yeah.
and they abandoned the project and they left it. And we wanted to finish it off and go into the chipset business with the standard chipset that we had, and we were not
Yeah.
allowed to finish it
By what?
by the person that was running the company at the time. He refused to allow us to go into competition
But we did go into chipsets ultimately, right?
ultimately.
Yeah,
But the
we were
problem
there.
is that design ultimately was
Yeah.
taken out of the company, and
Out the back door.
Out the back door, and it ultimately became Chips and Technology.
Oh.
Which replaced us as the fastest growing chip company ever.
And we could have been in the chipset
The
company.
whole
but
clone
they
business,
did get
every
into
one
it,
of
but
them
it
used
was
the chips and
Yeah, we
much
got
later.
into it. What was I can't think of the name that he was running the
John-
product business.
John Stockton, right? maybe?
No. It was the guy that ran another company down
Gordy
in Texas.
Campbell?
I'm sorry?
Was it Gordy?
Doug Bartek.
Doug Bartek.
Oh, Doug Bartek.
Yeah, Doug Bartek.
But didn't that all go down to Arizona then?
Yeah, and they
Yeah,
moved it.
Yeah, all right.
But Doug, Leon Humble, Doug Bartek,
But that was
John
a-
Stockton,
that was
but
a
Doug
number of
Bartek
years
ran it.
later.
And it was a very big, good business for us,
Yeah.
ultimately. So the standard product business.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was a grand
Well,
slam.
the other big one would have been ARM, but
Arm.
Oh, the arm too, yeah. That's another
That's
one.
probably, I don't know
PNC.
all the particulars, maybe Jack does, but
Oh,
that's,
Ron does. He was there.
that's probably the biggest missed opportunity. Of all the things we talked about, it's probably the
Yeah.
biggest missed opportunity of VLSI.
Well, yeah, because what happened is that we, VLSI, because of our relationship back in the Synertech days with a company called Acorn in the UK, and we were involved in working with them with processors, they visited us and trying to see what we could do together. And basically, VLSI, Acorn, and Apple put a team together, and it became the ARM group, the funding group for ARM. And what happened is that Apple was going to be the first customer for this new so-called RISC-based processor. And Steve abandoned it.
Well, it was
can't
going
re-
into the Newton,
It
and
was-
that was the first product.
Is
so-
that where it was going? I can't
Yeah, it
remember where it
was,
was going. But he decided he wasn't going to go ahead with it. And then, again, our group basically decided to abandon it also. And Acorn then ended up with all the rights to it, which became the
Yes.
funding or the founding of ARM.
Right.
Yeah,
But
so
we actually had a chance, I think, to buy the company along the
Yeah,
way,
there-
too. I
yeah.
think.
Yeah.
the VLSI, or the ARM team within Acorn used the VLSI design tools
Right.
to
Right.
develop
Right, yeah.
the first ARM chip. And the first chip was fabbed at VLSI in 1985, at the first ARM chip. And it worked the first time, and that actually the first mass set went into production. And so I actually just recently did, sort of sat on the other side, did an oral history interview with the two engineers who had created, had architected the ARM chip, Sophie Wilson and Professor Ferber.
Herman Hauser?
No,
Not
Herman
Herman.
Hauser was the CEO.
He was the CEO, right? He was the guy.
But no, Steve Ferber and Sophie Wilson were the architects, and then they had a VLSI design team, which was using the VLSI's design tools that actually created the chip, and VLSI was the foundry. And so they were able to spin it out from Acorn, because Acorn no longer could, it made sense for them to do it. And VLSI was a part owner of that operation, and based on our contribution of the design tools and so forth. I don't think we put money into it, but I think with the design tools and the fab and so forth.
That was our contribution.
That was our
yeah.
contribution.
The fab and the design tools.
But we had it as a core, and I think we actually sold the first, the first use of the ARM as a core chip was done through VLSI. And of course, that became the ultimate, story of the ARM. I think we continue to sell it, but we had an opportunity very early on that we did not we did not capitalize on.
Right.
Yeah, so today, and all the smartphone world has about 2 ARM 9s or ARM 11s.
Oh, yeah.
and
They're everywhere.
It's the largest selling processor.
I think the company has a
By
valuation
far.
like 15 billion, something like that. It is humongous.
Yeah.
But VLSI was at the forefront of a lot of these new developments that were occurring all simultaneously.
PMC
Amazing.
Sierra, how about
Yeah.
that one?
Yeah.
100 billion market cap.
So, reflecting back to what the environment was in the 70s and 80s, and all the growth and all the startups, and how that contributed to not only the growth of Silicon Valley, but to technology and actually the world economy. Do you think it's possible to recapture that kind of growth again in another industry, or something else, just reflecting on what we were doing then, looking forward?
Well, look at the software that's
Well,
going
yeah,
on in here.
I'm not sure where you want to go with that, but
Yeah.
this valley just creates opportunity. And
Exactly.
So there's just a number of industries that are really going very, very strong right now, and there's all kinds of data in terms of big data. There's a social internet. There's all
Right.
kinds of mobility opportunities.
Right.
There's still a thrive. Look what Apple is today.
Right.
There's just a number of ideas. I mean, that's one of the things. This valley reinvents itself every few years
Constantly.
to get into the new areas, and so it's never been as strong, in my opinion, as it is right now in terms of a number of different themes going on. So no, there's the number of companies growing very, very rapidly. I mean, the Facebooks, people didn't think about a Facebook, Googles, and Yahoos. I'm just thinking of the market capitalizations of those companies.
Incredible.
So the game companies like a Zynga and so forth. So no, there's tremendous opportunities, and the reality is one of the nice things about the nice thing and the challenge to the semi industry is virtually every invention emanates from the semiconductor industry. That's the good news. The bad news is it's tough to get good valuations in the semi industry because the margins get beaten down. You don't have the ability to price the products sometimes for full value. So while the semi industry in effect effectively creates every other technology industry we know, it's been hard to capture that value. I remember actually, it's interesting. It didn't actually occur during VLSI, but I remember when I went to Cyprus, and I left VLSI in 1989. I went to go to Cyprus Semi because, we all felt that the way you make real money at that time was in standard products, and that's what Cyprus did. And so I went there in '89, and I remember in '91, the SIA said the next year, this would be '92, the industry would be $300 billion. I always remember this, would be $300 billion. The semi industry just crossed $300 billion last year.
What?
Yes, that's a true story.
Wow.
So the industry is just, it's very cyclical. It's extremely cyclical. It always evolves in terms of winners and losers. And again, other than a few companies, now most of them are fabless, guys like Broadcom, which is doing fabulous work, and so forth, ARM, which is doing fabulous work. But other than Intel, it's hard to find very many semiconductor companies. Samsung would be another example that have real fabs. Most of them do use the outsource the manufacturing. And again, it's the fabless companies. A few of them make good money. We talked about Xilinx and Actel, not Actel, but
Altera.
Altera. Yeah, so there's a few of those, but I tell you, the industry is a tough industry to get get proper value for all the hard work you do. And I always say, it's one of those industries where you work awfully hard not to make a lot.
Yeah.
Because
Well, the
everything
fun-
has to work right. The design has to work right. The manufacturing has to work right. The sales has to work right. Everything has to work right, and then you might get a decent price from the customer.
And
For a
you-
period of time.
Yeah, for a year.
So it's a very, very challenging industry. But one point, and obviously I'm coming at it from the finance point, but there's so many, it's a good training ground for finance people because it is so hard. There are so many things you have to worry about. You do worry about, being able to interact with some very hard-nosed folks. And so it did train a number of qualified CFOs in this valley that did originally come out of the semiconductor industry.
Very true.
If you really look at what you need to have to get a company to be really successful, you have to have tremendous creativity, and the people at the top have to be able to take advantage of opportunities. And the worst thing you can ever do, in my opinion, is put operating people in to run a company as CEO because they don't have the strategic vision. You look at what we did in the beginning with Jack and Ron and looking at these opportunities and being able to jump right on them. And we never did a lot of planning on how you would do any of this stuff. We just decided we were going to do it. And we knew the opportunity was there, the market was there, and we were going to make it happen one way or another. And if you have operating people running a company, they start trying to plan on how you're going to do this. And the planning phase usually takes so long you miss the opportunity, or they don't realize what the market opportunity really is. And that's the best way to kill a company is, in my opinion, is put an operating
I
guy
remember
into it.
at Atari, we were like this with Atari because we're the only ones that could figure out how to make the Pong chip. And then the next year, they decided our micro was far better than Intel. We actually shipped more micros than Intel and Motorola combined up through 82 or so. But they would invite us to their offsite annual strategy meetings, so we'd be in the other room drinking beer usually. They'd come in and say, listen, can you guys double the speed on that RAM? And so we'd caucus. Yeah, okay, they go back. So they're refining their product plans that they're going to sell through Sears for the next Christmas based on us being right next door in the next room. And if you can ever get to that level with your customers, and I think,
Well,
So
ARM
that
was
was
the
in the
same way.
82 time frame you were doing that?
Well, no, this was like 75,
Oh, this was at
76.
Synergy.
When they were,
Okay.
Synertech, yeah.
Okay.
But the idea being, if you get that close to your customer.
But reflecting on VLSI, if you take a look back at all of the people that were there and the employees, there are some very, very successful people that came out of that company that moved on into other corporations that did very, very well, not only for themselves, but also for all of the stockholders of those companies that they joined. And I can think of many, many wonderful people that we worked with together there that were quite successful. Because VLSI was just a phenomenal place for that period of time we were all together. It was an incredible place.
We attract, I would add to that, we attracted some very, very,
Very
good,
great people, yeah.
very good people, a lot of talent. And again, I come back to, as I thought about preparing for this and thinking about it, I mean, it was really a transformative company, and that really it was, again, with the VLSI design, which was a new concept, we went out to hire the absolutely very, very best. It was engineering driven, and so we hired some very good people in design. We had a number of business units, which was also a new concept in those days. We had this concept of get big fast, and so we grew as fast as we possibly could. We took some risks. We went public as a You know, who thinks now of going public after 2 years of existence? I mean, now companies are 10, 12, 13 years before they go public. We went after
Yeah.
2. And this is in a semiconductor company.
Well, yeah,
no less.
unless you're software.
So even software companies, no one goes public after 2 years. It was unbelievable. So, so we did a lot, and we knew that it would take a while for the VLSI business, ASIC business, to catch on. So we got the ROMs, and that was fortuitous, but we made those breaks occur. And so it was a company that I don't remember exact headcount, but we certainly had well over 1,000 folks, and it was very, very energetic. And so, but again, the thing that I think about is the number of companies and industries that evolved from what we did. And the nice thing about ASICs, you now take them for granted, but you look what Apple does and all the great work they do. Well, guess what? That's what they use is basically their own custom chips. Now they do it a lot themselves, but that concept originated out of VLSI. That's where they first started. I guess maybe a little bit in Synatech before VLSI, but so you see very, very successful companies that really use the basis of VLSI to be successful. So a lot to be proud of that the collective team created back then.
Well, I think that we've covered quite a bit of the history of the company, and thank you for all being here. It's amazing that we gathered all the founders and the first employees. And it's quite a story, and I'm very pleased to see it going into the history at the museum. It's been one of my goals, personal goals, to see that ASIC is covered. Semiconductors first and then ASIC, and so this is quite exciting to
Well, thank
have
you very much.
contribute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Yep.
Great place to be.